So, welcome to my video on making a file jig. I wanted to make a file jig that would be able to work both inside the shed as a bench mounted file jig and also on the vise that I put on my workbench as a file jig for outside as well. So I started off with 4 bits of wood that I cut to length that I'd measured off the bench. I figured that measuring it off the bench, whatever worked on the bench would also work on the vise, and started joining them together with plenty of wood glue and countersunk screws to make sure that everything would fit up nicely. The one difficulty that I had with the wood that I'd picked this up as scrap wood from my wife's work, which is a cabinet maker's, and the pieces weren't all exactly the same width and depth and all of those sorts of things. So in order to make it look nice, I planed off one end, sort of chamfered an end, so it would all flow nicely together. This is not a necessary part of the build if you have wood which all matches nicely. Did decide just to finish the edges so it would all actually be smooth, and I was less likely. I cut myself regularly on bits and pieces in the shed, so decided to make it smooth. Now here you can see on my bench I have that slight lip, and this is where making it a bench made file guide, I wanted to make sure this would wrap and sit really nicely. So I measured and cut a couple of little shims just to be able to lock in underneath that edge on the file guide itself. A little bit of planing just to make sure that I've got a completely flat edge, and then glued and screwed. Managed to split both pieces. It was just stupidity. Didn't need to screw that hard, but those shims just help make sure that everything locks in nicely underneath the bench. Like I say, when you're using it on the vise, completely unnecessary, but it means that it has a dual purpose. So I then roughly assembled all my pieces and measured out 2-inch spacers on the top plate to be able to have the guide pin in place. I drilled pilot holes for an M8 bolt, slightly smaller than that 8mm size, and then used an M8 bolt to be able to create threads. And then for the base plate where the knife itself will sit, I created 2 rows of holes 1 inch apart. Again, drilling guide holes which were slightly smaller than the M8 bolt, and then using a drill to just put in that M8 bolt. It's unbelievable how hot this gets. I hadn't really thought about the friction of the metal against wood, but yeah, that bit got really quite hot while I was doing that. So then screwed everything together, bit of wood glue, and then pilot holes and countersinks. What I immediately realized, having put all this together, was that those screws weren't even nearly long enough to actually reach through the wood, so I re-screwed it once I'd got everything sorted out with slightly longer screws. Then put the base plate in place and used 4 screws just to be able to hold that together. So essentially at this point, your file jig is mostly done. Got that eyelet there to be able to make sure I can hold the guide rod, and then used a bastard file to be able to actually do my filing. Now, one thing that I have realized, the bastard file is fantastic at just raw power in terms of removing material, but it leaves a very rough surface. So I've also then got a second guide rod due to be delivered shortly with a smooth file to be able to get things finished off. And this was my first test piece. This is a little carpenter's knife that I was doing, and just thought this was quite a useful example, or just a useful test to be able to check that everything worked well. And yeah, it sort of does exactly what I wanted, which was create a really nice flat grind. This was actually going to be a chisel grind on both sides to create an ambidextrous carpenter's knife. The problem was it was horrifically noisy. So I decided to try and solve the problem by using some PTFE, which is essentially Teflon, to wrap around the eyelet to try and reduce the noise. This seemed like a really cunning plan at the time, but it lasted all of about 3 or 4 strokes before actually everything wore through. And you can see it's that guide rod is even eating into the metal on that eyelet. So here we are, just finishing off that carpenter's knife. And then just checking that it definitely works on the bench as well. I have to say, I think part of this was the noise was just so awful in the shed that I decided to do it outside so I could actually take a little bit of a break from that horrible, horrible noise. Once I'd got the chisel grind done down the center, bit of hand sanding just to be able to make sure that everything was looking smooth, and realized that I'd made the tip way too long and way too fine. It had no strength at all, was bending quite nastily, so decided to anneal it and reshape the tip. Right, so the good news is the file jig is finished. It's all sorted out and given it a basic test and it works. I made this little carpenter's knife, which I'm very pleased with. It's the first time I've ever done a chisel grind. Yeah, this is a gift for my wife's bosses, who have been looked after her very well during lockdown and then with pregnancy and maternity leave and all that sort of stuff. So I thought I'd make them something like they're cabinet makers, so I figured it might be a useful thing. So yes, it's made and it's done and I'm really happy with it and it works. But this is where I said, I think the title of this is going to be something, I haven't titled it yet, but I think the title is going to be something like the improved file jig, because there is one major issue with this, which is it's a really horrible noise. It's a really horrible noise. I've had a bit of a think and a bit of workout, and what I've done is I've got this little pulley block, which should be much better. And sorry, that sounds a whole lot nicer. But the problem is then working out how to mount this on here. I think, because the other thing that I became very aware of was this setup at the moment doesn't give me much choice of angles. Actually, even at its closest, it's still going to be a very shallow angle. So I'm hoping that by lifting this block up a little bit, I should be able to get something that will give me a much better range of angles, because at the moment I can't see myself actually using the far end. So I'm going to do a little bit of work. My plan is essentially to mount this little pulley block onto a block of wood and then have a bolt coming out the bottom of that, so that essentially that will then be my pivot point. So that's my plan. Except that plan didn't work at all. So I just mounted the pulley block directly onto the base plate, then decided to do a quick test with another knife that I had readily made up as a blank. Tried using a much steeper angle and realized that was way too steep, so put it back and managed to create a semi-decent angle eventually. And I have to say, just the sound was so much easier, so much better. It just was much nicer doing it this way. Right, so I just filmed all of that and then discovered that actually my microphone wasn't plugged in. That's not annoying at all. Not the only problem that we've got either. We've got two problems. First is that the angle of this is working well, but actually my knuckles keep hitting on the table when it's mounted indoors. When it's mounted on the vise outside, not an issue, but I want this to be able to work indoors and outdoors. The pulley block, my goodness, it just makes life so much nicer. It is so much quieter, it's peaceful, it's easy. So I definitely made the right shout on the pulley block. The problem is, as well as the knuckles issue, the angle just is too steep at the moment. So I started grinding on this one, and the problem is I'm already actually pretty much to my center mark, and you can see it hasn't taken off. It's only just taken off a little bit. It's working beautifully. The plunge line looks fantastic. I'm really happy with that. But I need a much shallower angle so that I can actually take away from the whole face rather than have this chamfered edge. My plan is to be able to do some knives where I will have a chamfer on it like this, but I want this to be a flat grind across the whole thing. So I need to lift this up. I was trying to work out got an option of either dropping it down or lifting this end up. I've been looking at different blocks and working out what will work, and I think this is going to be the best option in terms of being able to raise it up enough. So now I just need to find a way of being able to attach this, and I like the idea of it being able to be attachable and detachable so that actually I can have it at a high angle for when I want to do a high angle, and then I can also put it down to a lower angle when I need it. So I'm going to work out how to attach this, and then I'll give you my thoughts. So first of all, I used a clamp just to be able to actually lock it in place, and then used a little marking punch to be able to create 2 marks on the other side for drilling. I then drilled pilot holes and then had to go with a larger bradawl type drill. Well, that went roughly as well as I expected. So I was using the bradawl drill to be able to create a countersink for coach bolts to be able to go through that top piece and then out the bottom piece of the next one, so that I could countersink them so that there was no risk of them interfering with the knife. Created large enough holes in both the base plate and the top so that I could put my coach bolts through, and then checked that it all fitted up and screwed into place nicely, which it did. Now, annoyingly, I've actually lost my little hex key bit for the power drill to be able to do all the tapping and drilling that I did the first time around in the original base plate, but I have another one coming in the next day or two, so I will then be able to get that sorted out and essentially create a matching pattern for both the new top plate that matches the bottom plate as well. That's creating a much better line. What I need to do now is wait until my hex bit arrives and redo the same system that I had for locking everything in on the bottom piece. And then that means I can actually just undo these bolts and pop it off whenever I want to. Problem solving 101. So essentially, that's everything done. I'm really happy with that. I actually think it works. Like, I know the theory works because I did this one. And actually, now that I've managed to deal with the noise issue, and now that I've managed to deal with the angle issue, should be able to get a really nice flat grind when I want one. I don't think I'll do it on all my knives, but so this is all part of a bigger project that is coming. And I know I keep saying that, and I know it keeps not quite arriving. It will be coming. There's just lots of other stuff. If you watched last week's video, you'll see that I've got a new job as a videographer for a wellbeing company, so that's kind of taking a lot of my time at the moment. But yeah, it's exciting. I probably just shouldn't announce when I'm doing stuff, but yeah, this is all building towards... There's one big project that I want to do, but it'll also all be useful for lots of bits and pieces. I'm making a knife as a wedding present that this will make life so much easier to be able to get a nice grind on it. Yeah, thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Hope you've enjoyed the build. Hope it's all made sense to you. Yeah, I would say that's my big takeaway, is just think about the angles, because actually I don't think I'd put enough thought into how much variation there needed to be in the angles to be able to get either a kind of chisel grind, or whether get a full flat grind across the entire face of the knife, or just to get a little chamfered edge. So yeah, think about the angles. The pulley just works so much better than than this. This did not work well. Do not go with this, okay? But beyond that, I think everything else is fairly simple. So thank you for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to subscribe, and like the video if you liked it. Bye-bye.